It was 7003 when I stepped outside, thinking nothing of it. The street was quiet, almost too quiet, until headlights snapped on and froze me in place. 3 men stood ahead, guns raised, eyes locked on me, as if I had already done something wrong. "You were warned," one of them shouted, voice sharp and shaking. "You shouldn't have stepped outside." My heart started pounding, confusion turning into something colder. This wasn't a joke, this wasn't a warning. It was real. I raised my hands, trying to speak, to understand, but their fingers tightened on the triggers. The air felt heavy, like something irreversible had already been set in motion. I thought they were bluffing until the first shot was fired. Karen wasn't always this extreme, but she was always close. The kind of person who treated a slightly overgrown lawn like a federal offense and spoke about HOA guidelines as if they were carved into stone tablets. She had that tight smile, the one that never reached her eyes, and a voice that carried just a little too far. Especially when she thought she was in charge, which, unfortunately, she always did. Being HOA president didn't just matter to her, it defined her. It gave her a sense of control she clearly couldn't find anywhere else. The whole thing started over something so small it almost feels ridiculous now. Her cat went missing. Not stolen, not harmed, just gone. Probably jumped a fence and kept going, but to Karen, that wasn't an option. In her mind, someone had taken it. And not just someone, one of us. That's when the shift happened. Accusations turned into speeches, speeches turned into warnings, and suddenly she was talking about threats, about safety, about enemies hiding behind friendly faces. It would have been laughable if it hadn't felt so serious. Because once Karen decided something was true, she didn't question it. She enforced it. At first, it looked like one of Karen's usual overreactions, something people would roll their eyes at and ignore until it faded. But this time, instead of calming down, she doubled down. Within days, she had assembled what she proudly called an HOA enforcement unit. It would have been laughable if it weren't so unsettling. A handful of grown men, the kind who always hovered just outside real authority, suddenly walking around with stiff posture, cheap badges clipped to their shirts, and uniforms that didn't quite match but tried hard enough to feel official. Some even carried weapons, not with confidence, but with the nervous energy of people who had something to prove. They started patrolling the streets as they owned them, stopping people for small things, asking questions no one was obligated to answer. And Karen followed behind them like a commander inspecting her troops, watching, correcting, approving. You could see it in her face. This wasn't about a missing cat anymore. This was about control, total unquestioned control. Then came the rule that changed everything. A strict 7 p.m. curfew. No exceptions. No walking, no stepping outside, no movement at all. She framed it as protection, as if danger was lurking just beyond our front doors, waiting for the exact moment we slipped up. And if anyone ignored it, her enforcers would handle the situation. At first, people laughed. Then they argued. Then they started locking their doors earlier than usual, because something about the way those men walked around, hands resting just a little too comfortably near their weapons, made it clear this wasn't just talk. Most of us thought it was a joke until they started enforcing it. The next HOA meeting felt different the moment I walked in. The room wasn't just full. It was charged, like everyone had been holding something in and finally reached their limit. People spoke up almost immediately, voices overlapping, frustration spilling out in ways I hadn't seen before. Parents, retirees, even the quiet ones who usually avoided conflict. Everyone had the same question, the same disbelief. Who gave you the right? Karen didn't flinch. She stood there, calm in a way that didn't feel calm at all, more like controlled satisfaction. She let the noise rise before raising her hand slightly, and somehow the room settled. When she spoke, her tone wasn't defensive. It was certain. She talked about safety, about order, about sacrifices that needed to be made. And then she made it clear. The curfew wasn't up for discussion. It was staying. Something about that moment shifted things for me. It wasn't just frustration anymore. It was something deeper. A quiet refusal. I remember sitting there thinking, this isn't normal. And more importantly, it isn't right. And if no one pushed back in a real way, it was only going to get worse. Outside, her so-called enforcers were already pacing, watching, hands resting near their weapons like they were waiting for a reason. Not prepared, not trained, just eager. That's what made it unsettling. It wasn't control, it was instability pretending to be authority. I walked away from that meeting knowing I wouldn't follow the curfew, not out of defiance, but out of principle. Still, there was a weight sitting in my chest that I couldn't ignore. I had a feeling something bad was coming. I just didn't think it would happen to me. It was just past 7 when I made the decision. Not dramatic, not rebellious, just quiet and deliberate. I stepped outside, closed the door behind me, and started walking like I had done 100 times before. For a few seconds, nothing happened. The air was still, the street empty, and then the headlights snapped on. Stop right there. The Megarese sample scud through the silence so sharply it made my chest tighten. 3 of them stepped forward, moving fast, weapons raised, eyes locked on me like I was already guilty of something. I froze, hands instinctively lifting, trying to process how something so normal had turned into this. "I'm just walking," I said, my voice steady at first, then thinner than I expected. "This isn't legal. You know that, right?" They didn't answer, not really. One of them kept repeating the same line, as he'd memorized it but didn't fully understand it. Another kept glancing at the others, unsure, shifting his grip on the weapon like it didn't belong in his hands. Then, everything tilted. A loud crack split the air, so sudden it didn't even register as a gunshot at first. Then the pain hit, sharp, immediate, tearing through my foot and dropping me to the ground before I could even react. My breath disappeared, replaced by a wave of shock that made everything blur at the edges. "What did you do?" one of them shouted, panic breaking through the act. Tyron said. The shooter stammered, his voice shaking now, the authority completely gone. That's when it hit me. This wasn't control. This wasn't enforcement. This was chaos wearing a badge. Lights flicked on in nearby houses. Doors opened. Voices carried across the street. Someone yelled to call for help. The men stepped back, their confidence collapsing in real time, looking at each other like they were waking up from something they couldn't undo. And then, in the distance, the sound of sirens began to rise. Red and blue lights washed over the street within minutes, turning everything into a flickering blur of panic and disbelief. Real officers moved in fast, not shouting for control, but taking it. The difference was immediate. Where Karen's group hesitated and argued, these men acted with calm precision, separating people, securing the scene, calling for medical support before anything else could fall apart further. I was still on the ground when they reached me. The pain was sharp, but it was the shock that made everything feel distant. Someone asked questions, steady and focused, and I forced myself to answer through the noise in my head. What happened? Who did this? Why? And for the first time, I wasn't alone in trying to explain it. Around me, neighbors started speaking up too. The same people who had stayed quiet before were now stepping forward, voices overlapping, describing everything they had seen. The curfew, the patrols, the threats, the way things had slowly turned from HOA rules into something none of us recognized anymore. And then Karen appeared. She walked out onto her porch like she was still in control of something, holding onto her presence like it meant authority. Her voice carried immediately, sharp and offended, cutting through the chaos. She said this was her jurisdiction, that everyone needed to stand down, that the officers were trespassing, but no one was listening anymore. One of the detectives turned toward her, calm and unmoved, and simply said, "You're not in charge here." That was the moment everything shifted. Karen tried to keep speaking, louder now, insisting, demanding, redefining reality in real time. But her words kept breaking against something stronger. The facts, the witnesses, the injury. The fear in the neighborhood had finally turned into resolve. She didn't get to finish her sentence. The coughs came out mid-rant, and for the first time, her voice stopped working. The court case moved faster than anyone expected, but no one was surprised by the outcome. Evidence stacked up, too cleanly, too brutally to be denied. Witness statements, recordings, and medical reports, all painting the same picture of a neighborhood that had been pushed far beyond control by someone who believed authority was something you could simply declare. Karen sat through most of it expressionless, as if she still expected the room to eventually agree with her version of reality. It didn't. When the sentence was finally read, it landed like a final door closing. Years behind bars, restitution, and permanent removal from any position of authority connected to the HOA. The enforcers didn't fare any better. Each one faced consequences they clearly never believed would come when they first put on those fake badges and started walking the streets as they owned them. Outside the courtroom, everything felt quieter. Not peaceful exactly, but lighter in a way that only comes after pressure finally breaks. People didn't celebrate loudly. They just stood there, processing what had happened, what it had taken to reach this point. I kept thinking about how it all started. A missing cat, a few accusations, a rule that sounded ridiculous until it wasn't. All this, over something so small. And yet somehow, it had grown into something none of us could ignore until it finally collapsed under its own weight. She wanted control over everyone's lives. Now she doesn't even control her own. And honestly, I keep wondering how far would it have gone if no one had pushed back.